To everyone who has joined us this afternoon for our latest crisis management webinar. We'll make a start now. For those of you who've not joined a webinar before, my name is Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia. We're a specialist crisis management consultancy which works with leaders of organizations around the world to help them plan, train, rehearse, and sometimes handle the worst days of their careers. And I'm delighted to say that this afternoon we have joining us is one of our clients, Gus Whitcomb, who is Head of Group Business Resilience at Cathay Pacific. Gus, just checking that you're hearing us fine and that we're also hearing you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good afternoon.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Gus. So let me tell you a little bit about Gus, and then Gus, if you can fill in some of the gaps for us, please. So we conducted a social media simulation for Gus round about the turn of the year, and my colleague Alex Johnson, who some of you on the line know, who went out to Hong Kong to do the exercise with Gus, said, do you know what, I think Gus would be an absolutely fantastic guest for one of our forthcoming webinars. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. Firstly, Gus has primarily worked within the aviation sector, and we know that in general, aviation is a sector which kind of gets crisis management largely right, and certainly has an ongoing commitment and requirement to plan and rehearse. And I think there are some really transferable lessons and skills which can come across from Gus's experience in that sector. Secondly, he's got really great frontline experience of dealing with situations. Those of you who are fortunate to operate within perhaps slightly less risky sectors may not have actually had to handle a major live crisis. Gus certainly has, and can share some of his learnings from being right on the front line. I think there are some other interesting perspectives that Gus brings. For example, he's worked across a number of countries and continents, and so I think can speak to some of the cultural differences in crisis management. And although I think most of your career has been spent working on the client side, Gus, I know you also have experience of being a consultant too. So I just think that real richness and breadth of experience, I'm sure is going to be very interesting and valuable to the guests this afternoon. So Gus, perhaps if you could just tell us a little bit more about your career, and then I'm going to kick off with a couple of questions.
Sure, thanks, Jonathan. I'm actually humbled to be on this side of the microphone. I'm usually the one dialing in and listening, learning from other people. So an unusual spot for me, but glad that hopefully we'll be able to share some experience that others can learn from. As you said, I've been in the aviation industry almost my entire career. Brief stint inside retail, which had its own challenges. I worked for Walmart for a while. Certainly as the largest company in the world, they had the spotlight on them often, and unfortunately in some unpleasant circumstances. But aviation is where my heart is. Jet fuel kind of gets in your veins, and it's a fascinating industry. As you say, we're on the front pages quite frequently. So a good chance for someone who likes crisis management to have an opportunity to be involved on a daily basis. So again, thanks for letting me participate, and I look forward to your questions.
Fantastic, thanks, Gus. So I'm going to put some questions to Gus during the course of the webinar, and then we'll be taking at least 10 minutes of questions from the floor at the end. So please do post your questions in the chat pane as we talk, and we'll go through as many of them as we can, say in that last 10 to 15 minutes. So Gus, again, I know that you've seen crisis management both from the perspective of being purely a communicator in the first part of your career, and now being responsible for business resilience as a whole. So I guess my first question would be quite a broad one to start us off with. What are your guiding principles for successful crisis management and indeed crisis communication?
Yeah, I did get my start in communication. I think that was actually kind of an interesting start, because you know, as communicators, we often know a little bit about a lot of things. and it's helpful then when you branch into something that's more of a specialty, to kind of have that broad background behind you. I've been doing the crisis management rather than the crisis communications role for now about 6 years, and you do develop some things I think that are helpful. I would say that from a guiding principle perspective, there's probably 3 of them that I try to focus on primarily. One is keep it simple. There's nothing more complex than a crisis. To go through the chaos, to organize chaos to some kind of orderly fashion in which you're trying to approach something. Adding complexity on top of that just makes it difficult for the people who you're trying to get to be able to respond on your behalf. So, trying to keep it simple from the very beginning, whether that's in tools or ideas or responses, just tends to be something that works really well from my experience. The second part, and you'll know this from our conversations in advance of this session, is a passion for the humanitarian side and the real need to focus on crisis and its humanitarian aspects. Every crisis has some kind of impact on people, and that's where the focus needs to be, because if you get the people part of it right, 95% of your problems will go away. Get the people part wrong, and you just amplify your crisis. It becomes a crisis on top of a crisis. So that would be number 2, focus on the humanitarian aspects. And then the third one is one that I think we have to be especially mindful of if we're communications professionals, and that is backing up words with deeds. It's easy to go out and say we're going to do something, or to give some kind of platitude that sounds good at the time, but if you're not actually doing that, people are going to call you out on it, and you're really, again, going to complicate your crisis and make it worse on yourself. So those 3 things: keep it simple, focus on humanitarian aspects, and basically back up your words with deeds.
Excellent, thank you. Couple of follow-ups on that, Gus. On the people, the humanitarian side, now clearly that is a principle which all of the crisis textbooks has in it. How easy is it for organizations to forget that when the pressure is on and the business is facing all sorts of operational challenges? And how do you get leaders back focused on people if that ever is happening?
The people side is probably the hardest side of a crisis to deal with, and therefore it's the one that we always try to push off to the side. In the airline business, if you take probably our worst disaster, which is an airplane crash, in a matter of a few minutes, we have dramatically changed the lives of everybody on board that aircraft and everybody who loves them. And so that humanitarian focus has to be front and center in what we're doing. And so we spend a lot of time in advance of any kind of accident trying to focus on that people side. When we drill our what we call our executive command team, which is the group that actually leads the response from a strategic perspective, it's first question: what is the people side of this equation? How is the impact of what we're doing going to be seen and felt by the survivors, by the family members? How is that going to work? So I think in the beginning, you have to make sure that it's embedded in your culture and in your philosophy of how you approach crisis. But it's easier, and this is unfortunate, it's easier for us as crisis professionals to kind of fix the things part of it, or work on the comms, because that doesn't involve a whole lot of interaction with other people. And the thing with people is you say something to them and they speak back to you. So it's a more complex type of equation that you have to build into your response. But as I said before, it's critical. If you get that right, if you just treat people the way that they should be treated, treat them as human beings, understand what they're going through. A key component for the communications people is to listen. One of the most difficult things on earth for human beings. But if you listen and really try to understand what they're saying to you, you can respond appropriately. And again, take care of the people side of the equation, and a big part of your crisis is going to be less difficult to manage.
Sure. So I heard you saying as part of that answer, Gus, like every other part of a successful crisis management response, it's about rehearsing people first as being at the center of your strategy, so that that just becomes second nature when the actual situation happens. Is that right?
Yeah, practice is critical. And again, as I say, so give you an example. At Cathay Pacific, again, under my principle of trying to keep it simple, we define response in three pieces. Our response is either focused on people, it's focused on things, or it's focused on communications. Everything falls into one of those three buckets. And we put a primary focus on people. Doesn't mean things and comms aren't important, because they have an impact on people. But, you know, if you think about it, would you rather be told you're going to be helped, or would you rather be helped? And that's the way we look at it. So that people part is the part that we put the strong focus on. And you've got to build that into the culture. You've got to embed that into your response from the very beginning. And in your practice sessions, if you're not focusing on that humanitarian component and instead sticking to the easy stuff, so it's easy in an IT failure to fix the computer in some way, but what's the impact on, you know, your customer service professionals and their ability to provide service to customers during that period, you're missing out on really the key component.
Thank you. And I was also very interested in your principle of simplicity, and just to kind of explore that a little bit more. Are you meaning simplicity both processes and in terms of what you communicate?
Yeah, I think so again, going back to, if you can just think about what a crisis is, it's just complexity on top of complexity. So if you try to see if you can't simplify your response, you make it easier for people to do a better job. So yeah, keeping communication simple. And that again, it all starts with work in advance. You know, I don't think people really understand at all levels how important preparation is, about investing the human capital, the amount of time, the money that you need to do things up in front and get it right, versus trying to do something on the fly at the time. So, you know, from our perspective, we build checklists for people to do things, but the front page of the checklist is a very simple, color-coded, somewhat prioritized list of what needs to be done. And then we have a back document that fills in the how things need to be done based on those what's. But it gives our people a quick focus point, and understanding of what they need to get done from that perspective in a very simple, easy way to approach it. And then on the comms side, again, if you've done your prep work on your various stakeholders, you're primarily going to know what it is that they want to know. Keep it simple. Give them the information that they want, or if you can't, you know, then focus on when you can't give it to them and what's going to be available at what time.
Thank you. No, that's really clear. And I think, yeah, having those frameworks, having those kind of overriding principles in place are so helpful, because, as I know you have experienced, Gus, you know, you may have the most wonderfully detailed 50-page crisis management manual, but actually there's no way you can navigate a manual of that complexity. But understanding the real high-level principles and the structures, I think, helps everybody to move in the same direction. Okay, so let's talk about some of your frontline experience, Gus, and, you know, share some of the learnings out of that. I know you've been involved in a number of major incidents, most notably 9/11 when you were at American Airlines. Be really interested to hear, as far as you can, you know, the real learnings and perhaps changes that came out of those real major incidents that other people on this call could learn from.
Sure. I mean, sometimes it's hard to believe that 9/11 was 18 years ago. It will be, you know, coming up on the 20th anniversary shortly. But I think the lessons that we learned back then are still applicable today. It's unfortunate, I think, in our discipline of crisis management that we tend to learn lessons over and over again. It would be great if we were able to learn them once and be able to implement them, and we wouldn't see them again. But again, from my perspective, I see a lot of times different organizations repeating mistakes that we did way back when. And we're certainly not perfect by any means, but you know, you do need to learn from those mistakes and try to not repeat them, even in other industries and other companies. If you take 9/11 as an example, I'll just kind of walk you through a little bit of what happened that day. First thing that happened is we did what everybody does. You go to your plan, and about 10 seconds into that, we realized that plan was rubbish. And basically what happened is you just kind of look at what we were faced with on that day. Our plan had been focused on one aircraft, not two. It had been focused on one location, not two. We had wanted to be able to tell our story, which is one of the basic principles of crisis communications. And yet the very first phone call that came to us from the White House was that you shouldn't say a word. And so all of a sudden we weren't able to tell our story. We planned to fly to the cities where the crisis occurred and help those involved and their families, again following up on that humanitarian principle, but all the air traffic was grounded. And so basically there you are with this wonderful, beautiful plan that would have worked if you had one airplane in one location, you were able to fly where you were supposed to go and you could tell your story, but it just wasn't the case. And so there we were trying to figure out how to improvise what we were going to do next. And I got to tell you, you don't want to improvise on a crisis of that magnitude or of any crisis, to be quite honest with you. And so it's kind of humorous because I talk with some of my colleagues who worked with me in 9/11, and we talk about the fact that, previous to 9/11, if you were to suggest any kind of offbeat scenario for an exercise, people would roll their eyes and say, look, stick to the basics, mundane stuff that we're going to figure out, how to deal with. Don't go off in this crazy stuff. And now you have bosses who are like, call Hollywood and talk to the blockbuster screenwriters about what your next drill should cover. The reality is now that nothing is off the table. If you've thought of something, someone else has as well. So you need to be reasonable, but you got to push the envelope a bit. So 9/11 was just a huge learning experience for us. So if I just keep going and stop me if I'm sharing too much, but if you just think of some of the learnings that we had in that particular one, one of the key ones was the need to know everybody with whom you're going to work with in advance. So I told you the White House called us. They said, look, don't say anything. Refer all media calls to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI as they're known over in the States. And we were like, okay, do you have their phone number? Because we were used to working with government agencies in transportation, not law enforcement. And so here we were being asked to forward, phone calls to an organization that we didn't even have the phone number to, and had to look that up and find out who it was that we were going to be passing people off to. But I will tell you, a month after the 9/11 attacks, we were in FBI offices around the country meeting people. So I would say, government agencies, regulators, NGOs, anyone with whom you could be working, buy some stock in Starbucks and start having tea or coffee with everyone. You don't want to meet these people for the first time in a crisis. And again, it's time well spent. It's, again, investing, time and resources in that preparation phase, which is so important. The other part of the crisis, of learning from all these crises, but 9/11 especially, was that we're very good at identifying what we need to do, but we're really poor at being able to demonstrate how we're going to do it. So give you an example. For example, we do a checklist, and the checklist item says distribute the media statement. But in reality, that's just the what. If you think about how is who's going to do that? Who's their backup? What list are they going to use? Where is that located? Are we going to do this by fax, by email, by SMS? What account are we going to use? Who has the passcodes? Who checks to see if there are any bounce backs, and what do they do if they get them? Who makes any required follow-up phone calls? What are the numbers to call if the delivery systems malfunction? I mean, that's the how. That's the stuff that you have to invest time in, that you have to literally do process mapping to be able to get down to the nitty-gritty of how something is actually going to function. And if you don't do that how, then you join that club of organizations that fall down because they only know the what. In that whole thing with 9/11, we were able to improvise and figure out what we were supposed to do. We just didn't have that how completely figured out. And then you have people scrambling, you have people running around trying to figure out what they need to do, and it's just, again, it prolongs the response, it frustrates people, and it's really unfair to the people you're asking to carve out and do the response for you.
So some real practical planning, not just theoretical planning, as you say. Exactly how are we going to do this? Some scenario planning around, have we got the resources? Have we got the people? How would this work in practice?
Yeah, the big stuff is actually easy. We like to sit there and say that it's the nuance that's going to kill you. And a colleague of mine has this great way of explaining nuance. It's not the mountains that you need to climb, but the pebbles in your shoes. And it's that kind of stuff that just trips you up. We saw a recent article. All the 737 Maxes are grounded after the two tragic accidents, and there was a story about a group of passengers on an airline over in the States who became very concerned because they were, because of the accidents, they were paying more attention to the emergency cards in the seat backs in front of them, and that's a good thing, obviously. But they noticed that the seat card said 737 Max. And so they became very concerned that they were on an airplane that was supposed to be grounded. And ultimately they found out, from the airline, who had to go into crisis mode and, with their crisis communications, and come out and say, look, the card that we use for the 73 Max is the same card that we use for this particular aircraft. It's a different aircraft type, but the evacuation procedures are the same. But that little nuance, not catching the fact that that card had that aircraft's name on it, ended up causing somebody additional, heartache around that issue.
Yes.
And it's those little itty bitty things that trip you up every time.
Absolutely. I was also interested, Gus, in what you were saying about, after 9/11, no one blinked an eye at doing an exercise around, almost an unthinkable event, and that actually mirrors conversation I had with the comms director of BHP Billiton, the mining company, who were involved in a major environmental disaster a couple of years ago, and he said, no longer does he have any problems getting people along to simulations, or indeed doing a simulation based on the most catastrophic scenario rather than a mid-ranking scenario. And I guess more broadly, do you have any thoughts as how, the people on this call who are responsible for crisis management can get their leadership teams to engage with something that they may not quite believe could possibly happen?
Sure. Well, I'm very fortunate right now. I work for a CEO who really gets it. And matter of fact, when I approached him when he very first took over and said to him that we needed to do an annual senior management exercise, he said to me, no, we don't. And then I looked at him kind of strangely. He said, we need to do at least 2 of those a year. So yeah. I'm blessed with somebody who actually understands what needs to be done. But look, I think, again, you have to be realistic. You can't come with the blockbuster setting every single time. But what we do at Cathay, we do 3 types of exercises, and we mix them up. And I think, that kind of helps people understand why sometimes you need to go out on a limb and other times you're going to focus on the practical. So from an example, the first one we do is a live inject. So that's usually the one that comes with some of the more crazy scenarios, some of the more challenging concepts. And that live inject scenario is really about testing people's response times, understanding the real-time scenario, the pressure, understanding some of the different things that can come at you, the lack of information that you have to deal with in making decisions, and so on. And our team has really embraced that as a challenge. And I think, we don't get crazy. We don't are attacked by aliens or anything like that, but we do try to put some, challenging scenarios. The last one, we had the aircraft, hit a dam and end up creating a natural disaster on top of the original aircraft accident. And I think the team responded well for that. But we also, on top of stuff like that, we do a tabletop exercise, which is one where we sit around the table and people have a chance to talk theory. They have a chance to talk about different ideas they have about approaching things, about raising questions and seeing what other people think about. So a chance to kind of debate things. And in that time, a lot of the subject matter is actually quite mundane, but it's very important. And then the third type of exercise that we do is what we call a functional exercise. And on that one, we actually do walkthroughs of basic processes that we want to make sure are working properly. And we'll get everybody who's involved in something together, and we'll take it from A to Z, and we'll make sure that, that all the pieces are there and so on. So I think as long as you're helping, management and others see that there are very practical things that you're approaching in your exercises, you can go out on a limb every once in a while and try something that's a little bit more of a challenge. Again, being reasonable about it, but pushing the envelope a bit.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. Another follow-up on your 9/11 experience, Gus. What did you observe and learn about how people work under intense pressure in a situation of that magnitude? And again, did that cause you to make any changes in terms of your thinking around how you staff a crisis management team?
Yeah, the staffing part is always very, very difficult, and certainly a huge learning experience. So in 9/11, you sort of in advance as a manager have ideas of who you're going to appoint into certain roles. And when a major crisis comes, you can end up meeting your staff for the very first time, and it's a really odd situation when that happens. But in 9/11, I had some team members who were superstars. I had them pegged to do some really, really important roles, and they weren't up to the task. And then I had some people who were, less superstars, if I want to be nice about it. And you were sitting there thinking, well, maybe you could, do some runner work or something like that. And you find out that crisis is their thing. And you have to be ready and flexible to sit there and go, wow, obviously I finally found what it is that you're good at. And you let them, then take that lead role for a particular item.
And is that something about their temperament or personality that works in a crisis, or is it, just a particular area of skill or strength that perhaps wasn't required in business as usual?
Jonathan, I think there can be lots of things involved. So, we even just ask people to do a self-assessment right in advance of a crisis response, just because you never know what's going on in people's lives. So if my dad didn't die yesterday, but if my dad had died yesterday, and then all of a sudden you told me that I needed to go run the Family Assistance Center for this particular class, I couldn't do it. It isn't that I couldn't do it on a normal day, but what happened in my life yesterday has now complicated what I'm able to do for you. So it may be something as simple as that. In other places, it's just, I'm really good when you give me time to do something, but when the pressure turns on and the focus is there, and these people are screaming and yelling that things have to be done within a certain time frame, that's just not my thing. And again, on the flip side, you may find people who, when you give them 2 weeks to do something, they just procrastinate till the cows come home. But if you have that pressure on them, if it's do or die moment, that's their thing. They thrive on that. So again, I think you just have to be flexible as a manager to realize that you may meet your employees for the first time in a different context. The other thing I was going to add is during 9/11, we also had some employees who, they truly believed this was the end of the world, and they wanted to go home. They wanted to spend the last day on Earth with their families. And even though to me that seemed absurd, I had to be honest that was real in their minds, and I had to see things from their perspective and try to figure out how to encourage them to stay at work and do what needed to get done. But at the same time, realize that if that was where they were headed, and they weren't going to be overly efficient in what I was asking them to do, that maybe that was the right choice to let them go home.
Interesting. So it is also, again, about being, both flexible in the crisis. Sometimes even within your own team, you get surprises and unexpected things happening. And I think what you're talking about there is also kind of leadership and being able to motivate people at a time like that. And I guess perhaps leading on from that, you've observed clearly a number of crisis leaders. What makes for a successful crisis leader, Gus?
Yeah, yeah. We do a class on crisis response leadership for all of our frontline leaders, and we went on the web and looked, at surveys that had been done, and people always said that the number one response was that you needed someone to be calm, and I think that's critical. But I'd list two characteristics that I think are absolutely necessary. The first one kind of goes back to that whole humanitarian concept that I've been talking about. And that's, you need as a leader to be human. Just even going back to the whole thing about having to let the employees go home if they were afraid this was the last day on earth. Again, that's being human with your own team and focusing on the humanitarian side. These are people too. They're not robots. They're not, assets that you move around the table or whatever. You have to realize that you're dealing with people. And I think as a leader, you have to be human. And if you are human, and I'm not saying that as in, you're a biological human, but I'm saying in your approach to things, then I think you focus on different things in a crisis, and you, if, at least from my perspective, focus on what's most important. So if you always look at the impact on living things, I think that's a good start. So, for example, an oil spill isn't about a ship, right? It's about the people on the ship who need to be rescued. It's about the sea life that will die due to the slick. It's about the fishermen who are not going to be able to earn a living next year, thanks to the damage that's being done by the oil and so on. It's about the people. And I think as a leader, if you focus on that, again, you're going to do a great service to the people who are touched by the crisis. But again, you're also going to do a good service to your organization because you're focused on the right thing. I think the second characteristic that I would say is that, and this one is difficult for leaders, but we focus on this in our crisis leadership class as well, is you have to be able to admit when you're compromised. Again, maybe the tragedy is too close to home. We talk about, for our leaders, if you know somebody on the aircraft, if you have a family member traveling on that or something of that nature, that's going to be too tough for you to try and do the right job there. Or maybe you're simply not up to it. Maybe the phone call comes at midnight and you've spent the last 4 hours drinking. I don't want you to come to work drunk. You'll be my second shift. Go get a cup of coffee. So a real leader, I think, will opt out and bring someone else in when they know for a fact they're going to make things worse rather than better.
And that takes real courage, doesn't it? It takes as much courage to make that call as it does to step forward and begin leading.
I think so, but it's difficult for leaders because leaders think they have to. And I think you have to have somebody who's smart enough and, as you say, courageous enough to realize that the really right thing to do right now is to step aside.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked rightly a lot about people. I'm going to kind of extend that a little bit. I know you've worked across certainly North America and are now based in Hong Kong, and I know that your responsibilities have extended globally. What are some of the challenges that you face when managing an international crisis, and again, any tips on how to avoid, the time differences, geographic differences, cultural differences derailing your crisis response?
Yeah, I think on the surface, crisis response is very, very different across regions. In some places, for us, we're heavily regulated on how we respond. So you think of someplace like the United States, there's laws that tell us if you have an aircraft accident, you're going to do, ABC, XYZ, whatever, and you have to be, right in line with that prescriptive approach. In other places, it depends on who's on duty in the military that day, right, as to how something's going to go and what you're going to be told to do. So I think you really have to be flexible. But I think you really have to be focused, especially if you're a communications professional. So there's an airplane crash a couple of years ago of an airline that was based in Asia, and the accident was over in the States. And the issue is right there. You're dealing with a major issue. You cross the international date line. So at your home base it's Sunday, but at the accident site it's Saturday. And even just trying to make sure you keep times and dates straight are exceptionally difficult. And then you have, as you said, this whole issue with language and culture, and it's just incredible. But you've got to focus on that stuff up front while you've got time. So, we look at places like Japan in our briefing materials that we do for our chief executive officer. They're all pretty scripted as far as the kind of things that we want him or her to focus on. And yes. But you get to some place like Japan, and there's a side note that sits there and says, despite what the lawyers are going to tell you, you have to apologize in Japan. And when you apologize, you will make a very, serious bow at the waist, and you will hold it for 10 to 15 seconds, because culturally that's what's expected. You're not accepting a liability for anything in Japan. Yeah. You're paying respect to the people for this interruption to their way of life, to the normalcy of what they're used to. And you have to know that stuff in advance. And we partner with different airlines in different places to be able to take advantage of cultural knowledge. So we just signed what we call a mutual aid agreement with Korean Airlines, because we don't have a natural place in Korea. But the culture in Korea is extremely different. And we want to be able to ensure that we've got people who can really help walk us through, the critical aspects of what we need to do in an area like Korea. It's very interesting. Just for example, in every place that we have to respond, we have to be able to set up what's called a family assistance center, which is literally yes. a place where family members and survivors can go and get briefed on the accident and the type of things that the airline and others can do for you. And usually that happens at a hotel. In Korea, we can't sign an agreement with a hotel, because in Korea they believe that if they were to accept that assignment, that hotel would become known as the death hotel, and therefore nobody wants that moniker placed on them. So you literally have to find a gymnasium or a community center or someplace that's not going to be trying to do business and bring people in to be that facility for you. So you have to be cognizant of those kind of things, or otherwise you're trying to bring your way of doing it. So again, your audience by now, we've been talking for 40 some odd minutes, has obviously figured out from my accent that I'm from the States. And Americans typically are well known for coming in and wanting to do things their way. It was one of the early learnings for me when I moved over to Hong Kong, that, America isn't the center of the world, and we don't have everything figured out perfectly. And instead you could learn so much from other cultures and from other ways of doing things. And it's been a great eye opener and a wonderful lesson for me. Much more culturally, much more aware of the world and how things function in other places.
Thanks, Gus. And I was interested again in what you were saying about Japan. So, let's imagine you had a situation which spanned, let's say, two continents, or potentially perhaps even more. Would you, and I don't know if this is an impossible question, but would nuancing your response to meet the requirements of two different cultures or countries, would that take greater weight in your thinking than the requirement to be absolutely consistent in terms of that response?
Yeah, I think I would always be willing, maybe on the communications front, to sacrifice a little bit of consistency to make sure that we're being culturally sensitive. Where I would be hesitant to sacrifice consistency is in what I'm asking my people to do. Because once you've trained people to do something, if you change things in the middle of a crisis, you're just putting them in such a horrible spot. So again, I think, and it goes back to preparation. Look at each country that you're going to be involved in. What are the peculiarities? What are the sensitivities? What are the cultural differences? Focus on those. Make sure those are built into your plan and approach and your processes and procedures. And then basically make sure that you practice that. So again, it's more second nature than something that you have to make a change on at the time.
Thank you. So I've got 2 or 3 more questions, and then I'd encourage all those on the line to post your questions as well. We will take 2 or 3 of those in the final 10 minutes. So Gus, I've focused you very much on the response to a crisis. Any tips on how your crisis management planning or training can itself reduce the potential for a crisis happening in the first place?
Yeah, obviously the best thing in the world is if you could put yourself out of business, so that you didn't need to have a crisis response unit.
Yeah.
But the reality is there's always going to be crises, because people and machines malfunction is basically the goodness truth about it. Again, what we try to do is we try to keep our teams focused on safety, trying to figure out how, through quality processes and so on, how do you try to prevent things from happening. I had a CEO that I worked for before that really frustrated me. He always used to say, we're at our best when things are at their worst. And that was such a self-defeating prophecy, because, you think if you just committed a quarter of the resources that it takes to fight this fire at the end to preventing it from igniting at the beginning, we wouldn't even be doing this. And I think sometimes you have to get, people focused on the fact that it's okay to prevent crises. And even though that's going to take quite a bit of effort and quite a bit of resource. I've been blessed for the most part with CEOs who are pretty switched on, but on those ones that I've had difficulty with, I will tell you that, and what I've always found to be beneficial is when a crisis happens at a company that is a competitor, or a company that the CEO is very fond of pointing out as somebody that we should emulate. That's the time to basically take that as a lesson and come back to senior management and say, hey, look at how these guys handled that. If it was us, I wonder if we would have been able to do the same kind of thing that they did. And I know we look up to them. I know we think of them as a good role model. Should we make some changes at this point to try and figure out how we can, prevent stuff or be ready to handle things the same way that they were? At least in my past experience, that's been some help.
No, I think that's a great point. And actually, it was something we were talking to a client about last week, that obviously you hope you never have a crisis, but if you don't, then it's so important to learn from your own near misses or minor incidents, or exactly as you've said, Gus, to actually look at an event that's happened within your sector and spend some time really thinking, how would we deal with this? What would we do differently, better? So say if you're fortunate enough not to be having your own crises, then do use the opportunity of near misses, minor incidents, or indeed real crises affecting competitors to hone your own skills. And interestingly, we've now got a question which perfectly ties in with that, coming in from Oliver, and he's asking Gus, do you speak with other airlines to discuss their crisis plans or their crisis situations? Do you share best practice within your sector?
Yeah, absolutely. We meet on a regular basis as part of our alliance. So there's a group of airlines that has a commercial relationship together called the One World Alliance that we're part of. And we meet twice a year with them to do nothing but sit for 2 days and talk about, recent crises, recent things that are happening, developments in the industry, and so on. And it's the airline industry is very competitive, and there's about 1 billion antitrust regulations that you have to worry about. But the one area where there isn't antitrust regulations is in sharing from an accident response perspective. So we very actively go out and work with other airlines, especially in the alliance, to try and compare plans, share ideas, and so on. There are conferences that we attend through the International Association of Air Transportation, that allow us to do that as well. But I'd be real honest with you, I don't stay in our industry because, of course, our guys are familiar with what we deal with, and it's great to share ideas and so on. But I learn more from going to other places. I learn more from talking to trains and railroads and buses because they deal with different kinds of things that I haven't even thought about, but still within the transportation industry. And even talking with companies that have nothing to do with me, because having an active shooter or a bombing or something like that can happen to any organization. It's not just going to be an airline or an airport. So any place that I can go and learn from, I am happy to sit with those folks. And I am one of the few people, my management team isn't always overly thrilled with this, but I'm one of those few people that just says, I don't consider anything to be overly proprietary. So if we can share things between each other, learn from each other, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying about going outside of your sector, it's a good way of removing that tunnel vision, you know, that inability to think the unthinkable. I think it's a really good way of spreading your horizons and maybe contemplating risk types that you wouldn't otherwise have considered.
Yeah, it's more advantageous than I think a lot of people believe.
Great. Okay, so I've got a couple of final questions. Again, there's probably time for one or two more from the audience if they have them. But my next question would be, who's really inspired you over your time working in crisis management, Gus?
Yeah, Jonathan, there are a lot of great people that I've worked for. So there's a guy named Tim Doak who actually ran the crisis communications shop at American Airlines during 9/11, and I learned a tremendous amount from him. And a guy named Al Becker that worked there as well is probably one of the best media relation guys I have ever seen. And to sit in their offices and learn from them when I was just a junior guy was very, very valuable to me. I think, to be quite honest with you, though, the people that have since become tremendous influences on me have been the people who've survived crises that I've had a chance to talk with. I was one that comes to mind. I was introduced to this gentleman who lost his son in a plane crash, and
yeah,
I was so nervous about going and talking to him. But I sat down with him, and he was so kind. He opened this photo album with me, and he started, just introducing his son to me. And all that his son had accomplished in the short lifespan before he was killed, and then he just sat and started crying, and it just nothing drove home to me the impact of a crisis like sitting with that guy and having that experience. You really learn what the real impact of a crisis is. And again, why I have been focused on and will continue to be focused on the humanitarian aspect of crises. These people somehow go through this and they move on with their lives in a way that they use the experience to help those of us in the industry get better at what we do, point out where we have flaws and where we need to strengthen our response and so on. It's just, they're just amazing, inspirational people for me. And they have been the ones that probably have the biggest impact on me since then. And allowing us to really kind of understand that just how we design our response and the kind of approach that we take, can make a difference between, somebody being, like frozen in their grief or being able to, take the first steps towards the rest of their lives. It's an amazing experience, and one that, every time I get a chance to meet these people, I do now, because they're so inspirational and help me get focused on really what we need to be looking at and doing.
And Gus, I'm going to ask you another impossible question now, certainly in terms of the time available, but many of the people on this call would have been, I guess, fortunate enough never to have had to have those kinds of meetings. But in 3 or 4 minutes, what would you suggest are some of the key principles for supporting those people in the right way?
And the first one is really simple, and it's the most difficult thing in the world to do, and that's listen. Hear what these people are saying. I'm not an overly spiritual person, but my parents were, and they always taught me that God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you'd listen twice as much as you spoke. And in the opportunity to sit and listen to what people are telling you, you can learn so much. You can actually find out what's going to help you solve your crises by simply listening to what they're telling you. And so I think it's being willing to do that listening. It's being not afraid to get into the people part of the crisis equation, and focusing on that in the very beginning. The other stuff is easier, but I got to be honest with you, that humanitarian part is key, especially in things like airplane crashes or bombings, or even simple things like computer outages. What the impact is on an individual is key to the crisis. They don't really care whether the computer's down or not. It's what action that's preventing them from taking, or what difficulty that's presenting to them in their lives. That's the real key to it. So focusing on that is really what you got to figure out how to do.
Thank you. And final question, which actually is kind of one of mine, but one that's also come through in a couple of different ways from people on the call, is changes over the 20 years plus you've spent in this area. Any critical key changes that you've observed over that time, Gus?
So I guess I'd say I reminded the old saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Today we're pitched on, crisis management systems that try to formulate a crisis response based on an algorithm. And I get how these people are trying to help us, but every crisis is unique, and every organization has its own culture. That I'm not convinced yet that you can reduce crisis management to some kind of equation. We're also, and this I'm getting into your world, so I apologize for that, because you're much smarter at this than I am. We're also told that social media changes everything, and look, I fully admit that I'm an old guy. The first accident that I worked, we had no mobile phones, we had no laptops. We were, basically doing things by candlelight. So any of you out there would be right to question, who I am to give you social media advice. But here's what I firmly believe, right or wrong. I think that every social media battle is won or lost before it's ever fought. And from that perspective, this is what I mean. If you don't have street cred among those that you're interacting with, if you haven't educated the third parties who are going to weigh in either for or against you in a crisis, you've already lost. You're looking at a recovery strategy rather than some kind of proactive response. So social media has changed things, but at the very core, you're still talking to people, and it's still a humanitarian-based effort. So yes. Again, I think maybe a different tactic, maybe a different tool, but the fundamental is the same. And now I'm going to get into my grumpy old man phase, and that is about learning lessons over and over again. And I cannot tell you, the biggest pet peeve I have is how many organizations who have in there, if you go to their plan, their pre-written crisis communication template says, we're doing everything we can for those involved. No, you're not. If they asked you for £1 million, you wouldn't give it to them. If they asked you for a seat on your safety committee to tell you how that you're going to make changes in your organization to prevent crises in the future, you wouldn't give it to them. We're not going to do everything that we can, and yet organizations say it all the time. So again, you got to go back to saying what you mean. We're doing X, Y, Z, with each of those being a tangible thing that you can, show and demonstrate what you're doing. Again, backing up words with actions, or putting it another way, only say the things that you have examples to back up what you're doing. People will point out to companies who say that we're doing everything we can for those involved. They're very quick to come back and say, well, they aren't doing this, they aren't doing that, they aren't doing this. So I think, again, there's all kinds of lessons to be learned. I hope we'd quit learning the same ones over again. Certainly there have been changes in the industry, and there'll be more behind me. And it's great. I'm glad that we're trying to see some of the things come in that are happening, but it's the fundamentals, and I don't think the fundamentals change. I think keeping it simple, focusing on humanitarian efforts, and doing what you say you're going to do. I think those are the key things, and I don't think that's ever going to change.
Gus, thank you so much. You've been incredibly generous with your time, both in terms of preparing for this session and indeed over the last hour. I know you're incredibly busy, so I really appreciate that. And more than that, I appreciate you being so candid and so transparent and so generous with your sharing of your experience, which I know everyone on the call will have benefited from and appreciate. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I don't want to do a commercial for you and your services, but I really do thank you and your team for the great work that you did on the social media crisis. We were able to do things that we wouldn't have been able to do without your services. So I really do appreciate that.
Thank you so much. So for the final 3 minutes of this call, just a little bit of housekeeping before I let everyone get back to their day jobs. Just to let you know, first of all, that we are literally today launching our online crisis readiness scorecard. This is a free tool that you can get to via our website. We'll send you a link to it directly after this session. It enables you to evaluate how prepared you are for crisis against 5 criteria: culture, planning, people, capability, and response. And it will generate a bespoke report for you identifying how well geared up you are to respond in those 5 areas. Frankly, we know that the people on this webinar really care about crisis management, and many of you are frequently on this series of webinars. And apart from anything else, I would really value your feedback as some of the first users of the scorecard. As I say, it literally launches today, so if you do have time to complete it, and I suspect many of you guys on this call are going to be getting some really good scores, but nevertheless, your feedback on that would be much appreciated. So our next webinar will be on the 9th of July at the same time. It's going to focus on the cost of crisis, and that's really designed to address some leaders and some organizations who perhaps can't really countenance or understand how great the cost of crisis could be. So we're going to explore the financial, the legal, the human, the reputational cost of crisis, and what that means in terms of the requirement to plan, train, and sometimes handle those worst nightmares. If you have any questions about the session that you've just heard, please drop me a line or give me a call if you've got further questions for Gus. Gus, I hope you don't mind me saying that if people want to contact me, I will forward those on to you, and if you perhaps find 2 or 3 minutes to address them, you could do that. But you know, I'd be more than happy to help with any questions or follow-ups from the session. So once more, thank you, Gus. Thank everybody else who has joined this call. I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy days, and hopefully look forward to speaking with you again early in July. Many thanks.